right, thanks, Ellen. Can everyone hear me okay? Or do I need to speak up a bit more? Just a little bit louder? Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. So, as Ellen said, my name is Malin, and I'm an iOS developer working at Later. And yeah, today I'm going to talk to you about UI testing. And I want to start off with the purpose of this talk, or rather, what's not the purpose of this talk. And the point of this talk is not to tell you how many % of your app has to be tested or how many tests you have to add to your app, because I think that can be a little bit frustrating if you don't have any tests at the moment. What I rather want to do is to encourage everyone to start adding UI tests to your app and be a bit pragmatic about this. And I want to go through how we can use our current processes to actually fit more tests into our day-to-day life. So with that, I'm going to start out talking about some of the benefits of using UI tests. Then I'm going to talk about some of the workflows that we already have that we can leverage in order to add more UI tests. After that, I will go through some example apps that can benefit from UI tests. Then I will go through a quick demo just to show some UI tests in action. And after that, I will do some more in-depth coding about mocking and how you can utilize mocking for UI tests. So I want to start off with the question of why do we test in the first place? And in a nutshell, Apple is saying that testing is an essential tool to consistently verify that our code is working. And I want to break this down a bit. And I think, so I'm just going to move this chair. So I want to break this down. And what I think is important from this is that we're using tests in order to ensure that our app is working as we expect. We want to make sure that we didn't break anyone else's code or any other feature while we were working on something new. Another thing is that it enforces an overall good code practice. So if we focus on writing tests, we will also have a better structure in our code, hopefully. Another benefit is that it can help us speed up our regression testing and our manual tests. It can also encourage us to take more responsibility over all the changes that we're making. And the last thing that I think is important is that adding tests to our app will add a consistent feedback loop, and that will help us develop great apps. So I want to focus on these three last points in this talk. And for that, I want to go back to a process that we all know, and that's Git. We all know what it looks like. This is Git. We have our main develop branch. We always branch off this branch in order to create our new features. And then we continue working on that branch. And we might do a few commits until we feel happy with our new feature. And once we're happy, we are going to raise a pull request to get everyone else's opinion on it, to actually make sure that our code is to the standard we want, or that our code is doing what we want it to. And then we're starting to merge this in. And often, this is the point we start to test our app a bit more rigorously. So I think many of us hopefully have manual testing of the feature that we're working on this feature branch, but we don't often do manual regression testing and test of our whole app until we merge into develop. And I think this is a little bit of a problem. I think what we want to do is to look a bit closer and actually look at this feature branch. So I think it's important for us to start adding more and more of that type of regression test into this feature branch and into each push that we're making. And I think the benefit of this is that it's going to add some comfort to us, because we will know that our code is still working, and we might work on something like a UI view or an image view, and we think that it's only something that's going to be used in our feature branch. And then we realize that it might be something that's actually used in other flows of our app, and if we test here and we accidentally broke this, we will be able to know about that. And that will help us be able to actually change it directly, rather than waiting for it to go into our backlog and picking it up at a later state. And that all ties into our feedback loop. So if we're able to test on each of our commit, or just test as we continue progressing, then we will be able to get a consistent feedback loop and actually know if we accidentally broke something. Another thing that many of us probably have already is continuous integration. So this can be a system that we run somewhere else that basically runs all of our code, and we can add tests here. So this is a perfect opportunity to actually utilize those UI tests that we add. And if you don't have continuous integration, you can always take this as an opportunity to go and get more coffee. So this sort of ties back to the 3 points that I thought are important with testing. So I think we will be able to speed up our manual regression test in the end of a feature by consistently testing as we develop a feature. And that will encourage us to take more responsibility because we will know that we might have broken something. And it helps us provide a consistent feedback loop. So we will be able to test things often and make sure that everything is working and hopefully get a great feature out as soon as possible so that our users can start using that new feature. I want to look at a few different ways of testing. So I think many of us are already using something like unit tests. I think this is very popular. More and more people start to add this, but don't worry if you don't. But if you do, I think that's a great start. And this is something many of us might already have as part of our Git flow. Another type of testing, as I mentioned, is manual testing. And this is the type of testing that we want to, that we should all continue doing. Because I think if you're working on a new feature, you should do some manual tests to make sure that the feature is doing what you expect it to. And then we have the regression test. And this is where I hope that we can sort of remove a bit of a regression test by adding something like UI tests. So I want to look a bit closer at those two automated tests. I think unit tests are great. So if you have that already, it's really good. So for example, unit tests can help us to test a specific behavior of a function. So if we have a function that takes two different integers and then return a value, we can use a unit test to make sure that that output of the function is actually what we expect. Another thing is that our unit tests are really good to test the business logic of our app. So if we have this function, this is something that's specific for our business logic because we want to be able to test that we get the right value before we display it in our UI. And with that, we can test specific manageable chunks of our app. And hopefully this will help us to get a good maintainable code base. Because I think if we build functions in terms of units that don't have any side effects and have a single responsibility, we will sort of start doing this automatically in our app if we're thinking about adding unit tests later on. But there are some downsides to unit tests, and there are some things that unit tests are missing. So for example, the unit tests don't actually tell us that the functions that we are having in our app actually produce the output that we want and ends up displaying that in our UI. So we might have this calculate function and it returns the right value, but we don't know if it's actually being displayed in a label in our UI. And it doesn't test things, it's not great to test things like the relationship between our code and between UIKit code. So if you have a table view and you want to test your logic in this table view and you want to make sure that something is laid out correctly, it can be quite tedious to test that independent from UIKit code. And in the end, I don't think we should test Apple's code. I think we should test our business logic. Another thing is that it tends to not tell us that much about our app's layout and our app's flow. So we might have a button in our view, and we're able to check if this button is there with a unit test, but we're not going to be able to know if this button actually leads the user to a new screen. So this is where unit test comes in. I think unit tests are great for testing this type of integration into the UI components. And I think it's something that we can utilize to really test our overall flow and get an understanding of how the user will see the app. So I think if you haven't started adding UI tests already, I think it's important to start determining which screens that are the most important in our app. So I think we should start looking at major flows that we really care about in our app. So we should start testing things like a screen that we would want people to wake us up in the middle of the night if it would have been breaking. Those are the important parts of our app, and this is a good point to start testing. And after that, I think it's important for us to start testing flows that might not always appear in our app. So we might have onboarding as part of our app, and this might be something that only would display when you first install the app. So I think it's very important for us to test this, because for us to test this manually, it's going to take a lot of time, because we actually have to get the app into a state that it's not the natural state when you launch the app a second time. Another thing that we want to look for are edge cases that might not always occur. So we might have a login flow, and we might have a token, so the user don't always have to log in. But if this token expires, we will display an error message. And this is, again, very hard for us to test manually because we have to actually rely on having an expired token. And this is something that UI test can help us with. Another thing that are great to test are things that legally have to be in our app. So I don't think most of us have an app that's focused on our terms and conditions. I think that's not a very exciting app to build. So this tends to be a feature or a part of your app that's deep buried into your settings screen. And for you to test that manually, you always have to go through a lot of flows. So this is something that's great for UI tests as well. So I want to go through some example apps that would benefit from those type of UI tests. So this is an app called Things. And it's a really good to-do list app. I think it's $15 on the App Store. You should go and get it. And this app has this main functionality. You should be able to tick off an item. And once you tick this off, it should land in your logged items list. And this is a major functionality of the app. And it's very important that this is working. So it's great to add a test here. Another example is this Onboarding Flow. Most of us know what Trello is, but if we don't know what Trello is, they give us this nice explanation of it. And if we're able to also swipe back and forth in this app, and this is something that can be a bit tedious to test and can be tedious to make sure that those swipe actions are working, but it's essential for a user to be able to do that in order to get past the login screen. And then the last thing is this app called PackTrack. So PackTrack is a parcel tracking app, and the priority of this app is to track parcels. But it's very important to also display our privacy policies. So this is another candidate for a UI test. So we have identified some of the screens that we want to start testing. So I just want to give some recommendations on how to get started. So I think it's important for us to, this is very different from unit tests. I think for UI tests, it's important that we don't start testing too early. Because if we're going to have a lot of design changes and change up our entire flows, it might not be worth our time to start adding UI tests and then change that flow later on. Unless you're going to continue using the exact same elements, I think it's good to hold off with that. Another thing to think about is to determine those main flows and the main functionality of our app before we start testing. And this is for the sake of prioritizing what we should start testing, and then we can go from there. And then, like I said, we should start identifying things that are the most important for us in those screens. So if we don't have time, or if we don't feel like we should prioritize testing our entire screen, we should at least look for the most important features. And again, I think it's important to identify those very important edge cases, because this can often be something that's very important for us to make sure that it's working, but it can be tedious to test. So if you haven't started testing already, there is this tool in Xcode that allows you to record some tests. So it looks like this. So if you have your UI test class set up, you have your recording button right down here. And this can be a really good way of getting started with UI tests. So what happens is that you push the record button, and that will launch your app. And then you can interact with your app, and all of your interactions will be recorded in Xcode. So this is really good if you're not used to the syntax or you don't know what elements are called. So this is a good start, but it does have some limitations. It tends to crash sometimes, but if you get around that, it's a really good tool, and I think you can really benefit from that in the beginning. So another thing I think I just want to mention before I get into my demo is that, like unit tests, all of your tests have to start with the word test. And this is, I don't really feel like this is well documented. So if you start adding a function to your test class that doesn't start with test, you're just not going to run this test. And the reason for this is because Xcode needs to be able to determine which functions are actually test functions, because you might have helper functions that are sort of like helping you set up your test. So you want to be able to help Xcode identify which functions to run. Another thing is that you always have to access your app through a UI application. So this is basically just giving access to your main bundle and giving access to your main application. So with that, I'm going to start a demo. All right, so this is an app that I made. It's a very simple weather app, and it's going to tell us what the current weather is like. So, this is Raincast. The basic functionality of this app is to just let the user know what to do with the app. And then the user is able to enter a location here. By default, it's Vancouver. And then we have this Go button up here. And if you tap this Go button, it displays another label that just informs you what the weather will be like. So this is a pretty straightforward app, but some may argue that there are certain labels here that are important. So, for example, it's important for us to tell the user how to use the app. So this label is relatively important for the user. So I think this is a good place to start adding tests. So I'm going to move to my test class, and don't worry about looking too much at this code because I have it available in my GitHub repo. But I would like to highlight a few things. So this is our setup function, and this is something that you need for every UI test. So this is a function that's going to run before you start each test. And all that I do here is that I just tell the test that I don't want to continue after certain parts of my test has failed. So if one part of the test fails, I want to know about that. I don't want to continue running the test. And the next thing it does is to just launch our application. So that's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to add a test to make sure that this label that I mentioned is available. So this is going to be a pretty straightforward test, but I want to show it just for people who might not be experienced with testing. So all we do here is that we get our instruction label, and what we do here is to check our app, and we check for the static text in our app, and we look for a text that is called enter the location that you want to see the Raincast for. And all we need to do here is to just assert true and check if it's hittable. So the reason why we use is hittable here is because we want to make sure that it's actually within the screen and that the label isn't hidden. So if I run this now, it's not a very exciting test to watch, but I just want to say that it is working. So what's happening now is that you can see that there's like a second app there. This is basically this is a second app that's going to interact with our main app because UI tests don't actually have access directly to your code. It's actually a separate bundle. So you need to run this first in order for the test to run. And there we go. That was successful. But another part, so I'm just going to make this a bit easier to move between. There we go. So another essential part of our app is this Go button, because we need to actually make sure that our weather is being presented when we tap the Go button. So we want to make sure that this label appears. So I'm going to add another test for that. So this works very similar in the beginning to the first test I added. We just get our label here. And then instead of using assert true, we're using assert false to make sure that the label doesn't exist before we tap the Go button. After that, we use the app to access our navigation bars, and then we look for a button named Go. And then we tap this button. And then we expect it to display the label. So we're going to assert true, and we're going to check for the label. And here we're going to use wait for existence. And the reason why I wait for existence here is that I want to add this timeout of 2 seconds. So if the label isn't there directly, we will at least wait for 2 seconds to give it a chance to appear. And the reason why I do that is because I do have a small animation of my label, and I don't want this to impact the UI test because I actually expect that label to appear with an animation. So I'm going to run this now too. And this is a little bit more exciting of a test because it's actually interacting with the app. So it has to rerun the app. And then it's going to tap the Go button. And then the label will appear. And there we go. The test is green. So I want to build a little bit on this test because I think another important functionality that I don't think I showed you yet is that once you tap this Go button, the label appears. But I expect that the user would start searching for a new city if they tap this. So I want to make sure that the label also disappears. So what I'm going to do is to make a pretty similar test to my second test here. And the reason why I add it into a separate test rather than testing that whole flow at once is because I want to be able to narrow down my test cases. So I'm gonna add, here we go. I'm gonna add my third test. So this is very similar to the test I just showed you in the beginning. We just tap the go button and then we assert true. And here we actually check if our weather label is hittable, so we make sure that it's there. And then we're gonna tap the text field with the text Vancouver. And then we're gonna search false. And again, wait for existence because it does have a bit of a fade. And that's pretty much it. So I'm just gonna run it to show you that this is also passing. And the good thing with this is that if I would later on add another button that might be responsible for displaying this, displaying the text rather than having something in the navigation bar, is that I would be able to see that. I would be able to, if I reuse my go button for something else, I would be able to know that it doesn't display the label that I expect. So I would be able to get that feedback loop. So that's everything from the demo. All right, so I just want to do a quick recap, and I just want to say that now when I have added this test or those tests to my screen, even if it's a simple app now, I might continue adding features, and I will be comfortable knowing that my main flow is actually working, because I'm going to continue running this as I continue working on my app. And I know that some of you might be sitting here and think, but Malin, this is a very simple app. It's actually pretty stupid. It just displays a few labels and it doesn't really do anything. And I think some people might be thinking, what about apps that have things like system notification pop-ups or permission requests or things that rely on location data? Or what about things like login states? Or what about all those network requests in my app? And I know, this is an ideal scenario that I just showed you, and I think in reality our apps are a lot more complicated than that. And I think it's sometimes frustrating to look at tutorials online about how to get started with something, and it looks super easy, and then you sit down and you're just about to start, and then you realize that you have all those things like permissions, and your app does a lot of network requests that actually are important for you to display your UI. So I want to talk a bit about this. I want to talk about network requests because I think this is something that many of us have in our app. So if we look at this weather app again, this go button is actually supposed to do something. So if you tap this go button, it's supposed to make a network call to get the current weather. And I think this is an important part of our app, but this is not important for our UI to work. So I think we want to be able to make a UI test that doesn't make those network calls because we don't know what server our app is going to run on, or we don't know how slow our network connection is going to be. And we don't want this to lead to flaky testing. We want to test our UI, not our network calls at this point. And I think for that, we can use something like mocking. And mocking is something I'm going to use now for network calls, but this is something that's also a perfect candidate to be used for things like permission requests or location data. So what mocking does is that it's going to divert our network calls, and we're going to serve some static JSON data rather than hitting our network. And for this, we will use our app's launch arguments and our launch environment. So all we need to do is to pass in certain launch environments from our UI test to let the app know about certain criteria and certain conditions. So for this, we're gonna have to implement something like a URL session, which is our mock URL session. And this is gonna have a URL session data task, which is also a mock session data task. And what we're gonna do is to overwrite our resume function. So I will show you a bit of code, and it is a little bit, it's not messy, but it's hard to show in slides. So I encourage you to look at the GitHub repo afterwards. So as I mentioned, this is we're gonna use our UI test class, and we're gonna add something like launch environments. So what we're gonna do here is to tell our app that we're running in a UI test scenario by passing in this environment variable. And then we're gonna pass in the key of our JSON file or our JSON resource we wanna use. And then we're gonna pass in the name of our JSON resource. And this JSON resource doesn't have to live in your main app or in your main bundle. It can actually live in your UI test bundle. And then on the app side, what we will do is to check if we are running UI tests by accessing this environment variable. And then, in order to retrieve this JSON data, we're going to access this key, and we're going to use that to create our JSON strings. And this is a bit of code. I just want to go through this. I don't want to go through it in too much detail, but this mock session is what's important. So this mock session takes this data file that we just created. And what this mock session does is that it simply just overwrites our data task. And what it does here is that it's going to return a mock session data task instead. And if we look at this function, this takes our JSON data that we're already familiar with, and this overwrites our resume function. So if you're familiar with network requests, we always call our resume function in order to hit our network. But what we're going to do in this resume function is to create our custom response. And in this case, it's going to be a 200 status code. And then we're going to create data from our JSON data. And then instead of hitting the network here, we will call completion directly, and we just return the response that we want for that UI test. And if you look at the network manager for your class, you don't actually have to do any alterations here. All you need to do is to just call your network task and the resume function, and that's going to automatically run return your mock data if you're running it in a UI test scenario. And as I mentioned, this is something that we can also use for something like location access or user permissions and things like that that can be really tedious for our UI tests. And I know this has been it's been a lot of code, so I just want to go through a few fun facts that I found really useful when I'm writing my UI tests. So one thing is that we can use this handy command to actually speed up our layer. So what this does is that it's actually going to run all of our animations in our UI test on 100 times quicker. And the benefit of this is that you don't have to wait as long for your animations to finish. Another thing is that you can use this command to test your SiriKit implementations. So if you have something like a SiriKit command, you don't have to speak out loud to your phone anymore. So this is perfect for an open office. You can just use your UI test to just make your test your SiriKit commands. And if you're still not convinced, I just want to mention that at the moment there are 11 devices in the App Store that need screenshot. And if you're gonna support multiple languages, that I think many of us do, that's gonna grow exponentially. And realistically, we're not gonna stop our release process in order to take screenshots for all of those devices. What we're gonna do is to often end up with like outdated screenshot of what our app is looking like. So we might tell our user that our app is gonna look like this, but in reality, it's been evolving and it looks like this. And the reason why I talk about this is because if you have been a good citizen and already added your UI test, you can use something like Fastlane to actually generate screenshots automatically. So all you will need to do is so Fastlane, for those who don't know, is a open source tool that you can use. So Fastlane has this command called snapshot, and all you need to do is to just add this to all of your UI tests that includes a screen that you want to submit to the App Store and the display for your app. So that's really neat, and all you need to do is to run this, and it can take usually about half an hour or less, and it can actually submit all of your screenshots automatically to the App Store and to App Store Connect. So that's really good. But more on that is a story for another time. And I just want to finish up. I want everyone to take away from this that I think it's important to start somewhere. And I think with that, we should really start to prioritize what's important in our app. And it's important for us to be pragmatic when we start adding those tests and think about our current flows and try to add tests to this flow. And the last thing is that I think testing is a team effort. I think we all make apps together, and we should also guarantee that they work together as a team. Thank you. Also, if you want to get in contact with me, I'm on Twitter or Mastodon if you don't like Twitter. And I also recently started a meetup with Kai, which is more of a social meetup for us to talk about iOS development. So you should check that out. We have one on Sunday. I also make a podcast if you're interested in hearing me talk about tech. And this is the GitHub repo if you want to have a look at the code.
Awesome. Thanks, Malin.
Sorry.